Very pleased right now to have Dinesh D'Souza on the line with me. He's an author and filmmaker. You guys know him quite well, I'm sure. His new book, The Big Lie, Exposing the Nazi Roots of the American Left, is out now. I read the book. It's fantastic, as is all Dinesh's books. So many of you don't even remember Dinesh from a former life, but Dinesh really got his start as being an intellectual writer. And then now you guys think of him more of as a provocateur and someone who sticks his thumb in the eye of the establishment media. So Dinesh, let's start there, which is I just love your story so much. You're an Indian immigrant. You came here when you're 17. You started your career writing about how great Western religion, Western culture, and America is. And this made you, at one point, number one, probably still top 5 to 10 enemies of the American left. I mean, I can't think of a better life story than that, personally.
Well, I've experienced in my own life the American dream, a kind of ladder of opportunity that allows you to start at the bottom and move up. And that's possible in America. And I realized over time that the conservative point of view is the philosophy of the American dream. And remarkably, that the left is trying to, in various ways, replace the American dream with something different, a kind of idea of subservience to the state. And so my politics is based on that. And then in 2012, I pivoted from being a think tank guy and speaker to making these documentary films, and an opportunity to reach a much larger audience and also convert intellectual arguments into visual and emotionally powerful content. So I'm really enjoying my life as a writer and also as a filmmaker.
Yeah, and you write about this quite brilliantly towards the end of the book, or maybe about 3/4 of the way through the book, where you talk about the left's dominance in the 3 core cultural institutions, media, Hollywood, and academia, and saying that you take a pretty pessimistic view on our abilities to reverse this stuff. So this is part of what makes you powerful, is that coming as a conservative figure and someone whose brand was a conservative brand, really working on communication of ideas, not simply on the ideas themselves, which our ideas are, of course, so much better than the left's. It's that we're horrible at communicating them relative to the left because we don't have these core cultural institutions. And that's a theme that occurs throughout the book. And you've done a great job of reaching just about the maximum number of people you can reach with some of your documentaries, not to mention your bestsellers. So it's great strategy. And talk about how you sort of learned that from the left, which is really interesting. Seeing the left's dominance in those institutions was an influence on you.
Well, I kind of begin with the sense of outrage in discovering that the left really doesn't want to hear a different point of view. And not only that, but they're willing to use their power in academia, in entertainment, in Hollywood, in order to drown you out, drive you out, try to make you a pariah, and in some cases just ruin your career. I mean, the Nazis had a term, Gleichschaltung, which means coordination, but what it refers to is forcing all of society into conformity with Nazi ideology. And I see political correctness in America, not just the sensitivity about language, but the way in which if you work in Hollywood and you fall athwart the studio bosses, you're out of there. In academia, they'll try to destroy your career. So this kind of ruthless enforcement of a single point of view, our own Gleichschaltung, if you will, has made me very determined to try to break these monopolies and try to plant a conservative flag, you might say, in areas where the left is really strong.
Yeah, and you got that killer combination that guys like Milo and Ian Coulter have, where you have the ability to get attention with some light trolling, and then you crush them with intellectual arguments as well, which is just deadly. And you see it in the book, The Big Lie. So let's talk about what is the big lie.
Well, the big lie is the notion that fascism and Nazism are on the right. The big lie is something that is not, I mean, we've been hearing this big lie very stridently since Trump's election, but the big lie dates back to the post-World War II era. See, once the American troops liberated the concentration camps and the emaciated, tottering figures came ghost-like out of those camps and people saw those images, fascism and Nazism were completely and permanently discredited. But before that, fascism and Nazism held great fascination on the left. FDR admired Mussolini. The two of them were kind of a mutual admiration society. A lot of leftists had nice things to say about Hitler. Gertrude Stein, the famous writer, proposed that Hitler get the Nobel Peace Prize in 1937. Wow. W.E.B. Du Bois, the progressive intellectual, had nice things to say about Nazi Germany, as did JFK. Now, after the war, the progressives coming into power in academia and the media, who knew about this, they were deeply embarrassed by it, and they were worried by it because they knew that if this record became known, progressivism and, in fact, the Democratic Party would take a massive hit. And so they began a kind of intellectual cover-up just to leave this stuff out of the textbooks and then very cleverly to move fascism from the left wing into the right wing column. And all the stuff we see about Charlottesville is the product of that 75-year-old intellectual feat.
Yeah, and this is a crucial thing, and I think you've answered my next question. My next question was, it's a substantial book. It takes a lot of research, and I'd like to get into that a little more later on in the segment. But this is a big undertaking, and it's something that is proving a historical point, which is that the left has manipulated the terms Nazism and fascism in particular. And so the question is, Dinesh, why go to these lengths? Why does it matter if whether or not Hitler or the fascists are on the right or the left? Why did you feel it so necessary to prove the point that they are, in fact, on the left?
Well, let's step back for a moment. In my last book, I took on the race card. And in this book, I'm taking on the fascism card. Now, let's think of what role these cards play. They're essentially ways of putting the other side up against the wall. And they're ways for the left to grab the moral high ground and grab it so decisively that, in a sense, there's no point having an argument because the other side is declared in advance to be the bad guy. So there's no point, for example, having an argument with an out-and-out racist. And so if you can show that the Republican Party is the party of racism, that conservatives are deep in their hearts bigots, then you won the argument, and the other side, in a sense, is already a pariah. The fascism card is even more incendiary than the race card because Nazism is almost the touchstone of evil in the modern world. It's associated with Holocaust, and so the left plays these kinds of incendiary cards. They're playing it against Trump with a very specific purpose. What they're basically saying is, we don't care if Trump was lawfully elected. He's a fascist. He's sort of like Hitler in the 1930s. And so the point is not just to insult him, but to justify a whole series of extremist, violent, and in some senses even a kind of quasi-coup against Trump, all becomes then warranted because the left says, we're fighting against Hitler circa 1933. Wouldn't it have been better if we could have removed Hitler by any means necessary? Think of all the carnage that could have been averted. The same applies to Trump.
All right. Dinesh D'Souza, again, is my guest, the author of the new book, The Big Lie, Exposing the Nazi Roots of the American Left, available now. You can get it on Kindle and on Audible as well if you want to listen to it. So giving your thoughts quickly on what's happened in Charlottesville and this trying to pin ideas that are really not associated with mainstream conservative thought in the slightest and blame it all on conservatives, Trump, Bannon, Breitbart, etc.
So there's a big lie going on with regard to all this stuff about monuments. And the big lie is the lie that the South is the culpable party, that the South is to blame for slavery and not the Democratic Party. Now, the secession debate was between the North and the South. And, of course, it was only Southern states that seceded. But the secession debate was preceded by a 50-year-old intense slavery debate. And the slavery debate was not between the North and the South. The slavery debate was between the pro-slavery Democratic Party in the North and the South and the anti-slavery Republican Party. So consider the Northern Democratic Party, led by Stephen Douglas. It assiduously protected slavery. And yet all of this is covered up because after the war, the Democrats have tried to move the blame from themselves to the South.
We have Dinesh D'Souza on the line. His new book, The Big Lie, Exposing the Nazi Roots of the American Left. Sounds pretty extreme until you read the book, and then the case is fairly compelling. So, Dinesh, just to reset, because it was a long break, the Nazi roots of the American left. In a nutshell, give us an example or two of what you mean by that.
Well, first of all, let's start with the core meaning of fascism. The left has sort of disguised the meaning of fascism because they know that if it was known, it would apply directly to them. Fascism is the ideology of the centralized state. Mussolini put it very well. He's the founder of fascism. He established the first fascist regime in the world. He says everything in the state and nothing outside the state. In other words, the state controls the private economy. The state also controls your life. Now, that doesn't sound a whole lot like Trump or the platform of the Republican Party, but it does sound eerily similar to the platform of the Democratic Party. And so that's the ideology of fascism. Second, the leaders of fascism were all on the left. Fascism was founded by 24 or so labor leaders and intellectuals all across Europe. In France, in Germany, in England, in Italy, they were all Marxist, socialists, or leftists. Mussolini was a Marxist, actually an associate of Lenin, who sent him a telegram of congratulations when he did his march on Rome. Hitler was the leader of the National Socialist Party. So all of this had to be disguised in order to pretend that fascism is somehow right-wing. Then the book really takes off because it shows the deep, intimate connections between the Democratic Party and both fascist Italy and Nazi Germany. And specifically, I show that Hitler got some of his most genocidal, destructive ideas from the Democrats.
Yeah, and a couple of the figures that come up in particular throughout the book are Woodrow Wilson and FDR. Let's talk about those guys in terms of the true history that a responsible American education system would present about these men.
Well, let's just say a word about each.
He was the head of the House Republican.
That's the issue in Charlottesville. So Woodrow Wilson is almost single-handedly responsible for the revival of the Ku Klux Klan. Although the Klan was started in the 19th century, the Republicans basically shut it down. For several years, there was no Ku Klux Klan. And then Woodrow Wilson in the early 20th century screened a pro-KKK movie in the White House, and it instigated a Klan revival. The Klan even spread to states where it wasn't there previously, states outside the South. So if anyone's going to be going around pulling down statues, Woodrow Wilson is a pretty good candidate to have his statues pulled down. FDR was actually in bed with some of the worst racists in America. In order to pass the New Deal, FDR sat down with some of the Southern Democrats. These are people who would go into racial rants on the Senate floor. And he cut a deal with them in which the Southern racists basically said to FDR, we'll support the New Deal, but you've got to agree to A, exclude blacks from New Deal programs, and B, agree to block all anti-lynching laws. FDR agreed. And so this dirty bargain between FDR and the Southern racists, all Democrats, by the way, this is described in historian Ira Katznelson's book called Fear Itself. It's all there in the historical record. But again, it's been sort of sanitized from the textbooks. Why? Because FDR is this progressive icon. I don't see anyone pulling down FDR statues or renaming airports and buildings that have FDR's name on it. So this is the actual history of the Democratic Party. Once again, what we're seeing is a projection. The sins of the Democrats are now projected onto the South or the white man or America. And this is the case of what Freud called transference. You try to move the blame from yourself to someone else, make them the guilty party, and then bash them for it.
Okay, Dinesh D'Souza is on with me. His book, The Big Lie, Exposing the Nazi Roots of the American Left. Now, one thing that you always do quite well, Dinesh, is your research is impeccable as usual. And one thing that you cited that I've been waiting for this for about 10 or 12 years is the book drafts off heavily from Anthony James Greger, who's a professor at UC Berkeley. Now, I studied under Dr. Greger for a year. He's clearly the most knowledgeable person on the concept of fascism. And literally one of my final exam questions questions for him was defining fascism, which had, I think, 7 or 8 key core tenets to them. And we're going to have Dr. Greger on the show, even though he's very old. So we're going to have to do this as a pre-tape. It could take some deft maneuvering from producer Paul, but we're going to get him on. When did you come in contact with him, and when did you realize this was really the guy who understands the fascism the best?
Well, I started by looking and trying to dig into the meaning of fascism. I realized that the left has sort of its favorite, if you will, fascism scholars. So one of them is Robert Paxton at Columbia University. And this guy's a very kind of sneaky intellectual because he feeds the left exactly what it wants to hear. So he'll say things, oh, gee, when Trump crosses his arms and looks to the left, he looks exactly like Mussolini. So I thought, wow, what a shallow argument for an actual scholar to make. Then I began to say, are these the guys who really know what they're talking? Who's the greatest living authority, for example, on Italian fascism? Well, it turns out it's a guy in Italy named Renzo De Felice. And Renzo De Felice and other scholars cite the work of Greger. Greger's now, as you say, I think he's in his 80s, maybe even 90. But he has, a whole procession of books, a very deep understanding of fascism, particularly Italian fascism. Now, the reason I'm mentioning Italian fascism is that not only is it the quintessential fascism, but it actually is pure fascism. The Nazis were not pure fascists. And in fact, Hitler rarely called himself a fascist. You can read Mein Kampf, and the word fascism almost never appears. So to understand pure fascism, you have to go to the people who really know what they're talking about. Greger is one of them. And that's the point of the book is I don't cite sort of, quote, right-wing scholars. I'm actually citing history that's indubitable, unquestionable, there in the record. That's why when I laid out the 3 things that Hitler has learned from the Democratic Party, there hasn't been a whisper of dissent. No one has even been able to question the research, let alone contradict it.
Yeah, it's such a good point, and that's something that we come in contact with at Breitbart all the time, is that I opened the show talking about how I'm anticipating a story suggesting some of our coverage of H.R. McMaster is based on some conspiracy between me and Steve Bannon trying to cook something up from the West Wing. And there's nothing further from the truth. And part of it, the reason you know that, Dinesh, is because we can't put up anything at Breitbart that's not factual, or else we get hammered in the public square. And this is the same thing with your book as well, is that you say some things that on their face seem like some tough talk, and then you go into the details, you look at the endnotes, and then all of a sudden it's like, oh yeah, this is actually 100% accurate. That's think of the senior Nazis, drafting the notorious Nuremberg laws, which turned Jews into second-class citizens, confiscated their property, segregated them, forbade intermarriage between Jews and Germans. Here are the Nazis sitting around a table drafting these laws, and in their hands are the democratic laws from the American South, the so-called Jim Crow laws, which did the same thing. They outlawed intermarriage. They had state-sponsored segregation. And so the Nazis, in effect, are crossing out the word black and writing in the word Jew. They're drafting the Nuremberg laws directly based on the blueprints supplied by American Democrats. All right. So Dinesh D'Souza, the book is The Big Lie, Exposing the Nazi Roots of the American Left. Dinesh, last question for you. You've been very generous with your time. Hopefully some people pick up the book. It's an important book, and it is something that bring this to your next cocktail party. Bring the arguments in here and challenge those who are calling everyone on the right Nazis at this point in time. You close the book by writing about denazification. What can we do in American life to start the healing process? Because the left clearly not interested based off of the media coverage in the last few days.
Yeah, the most important thing is not the healing process, but the knocking out of the moral power of the fascism card, like the race card. Once the race card has been stripped of its power, it can't be played anymore. And once you take away these cards from the left, essentially you deprive the Democratic Party and the left of a lot of its moral power. It's sort of arrogant claim to rule. And so that's the first step. The second step, I think, is to uniformly enforce the law. Certainly the white supremacist who plowed into that woman is going to get his comeuppance. But what about all those 200 people who were arrested for felony rioting during the inauguration? By the way, 11 of them were journalists. Now, normally the left takes the view that if we get arrested, we should be left in jail overnight and then let out as a martyr in the morning. But felony rioting carries 5 to 10 years in prison. Seems to me once we enforce the law against a lot of these guys, give them some 5 and 10-year prison sentences. A lot of this nonsense would then be stopped.
Dinesh D'Souza, thank you, sir. Appreciate it so much. We will catch up with you soon. Also, he's got a big column coming out at Breitbart as well, and love to see him out there. One of the fonts of information, and a great patriot. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, I appreciate it.